Welcome to TalentWise, a podcast dedicated to identifying and unpacking challenges and solutions related to the workforce. Each week, we'll hear from experts in their field or industry who are fighting to better understand shifting dynamics. What are those dynamics? Put most simply, the workforce crisis we've been talking about and seen coming for decades is now upon us, and most of us aren't nearly as prepared as we should be. To frame that problem, demographers globally are seeing birth numbers plummeting in both developed and developing countries, and the effects are already being felt in parts of Europe and in the United States. Here in Alabama, where today's conversation is taking place, we have seen more of the state's residents die since 2020 than the number of newborns over the same period of time. To oversimplify, so goes Alabama, so goes the nation. This is a universal problem. Combine a declining population with the state's nearly record low workforce participation numbers, creates a multiplier effect that Alabama's public and elected officials are seriously concerned about. For example, Governor Ivey recently created the Alabama Department of Workforce to combat some of the workforce challenges we will discuss today and in future episodes. Similar workforce departments have been formed in many states across the country. But this is a complicated problem to solve and will require smart strategic thinking, a willingness to collaborate within and among industries, and a demonstrated ability for the business, education, and economic development communities in cities, states, regions, and nations working together effectively in ways they never have before. But enough about me. Today we are thrilled to welcome our guest, Dr. Nyesha Black. How are you today, Nyesha?
I'm doing very well. Thanks for asking.
Well, thank you so much for being here. Nyesha is the Director of Demographics at a large university and has extensive expertise in this particular area. She knows the problem by the numbers better than anyone, and we are so glad to have you on TalentWise today. Thank you for joining us. So tell us, how did you get into this work? What was it that happened to you that caused you to be a demographer?
It happened by accident, actually. I was a student in undergrad, and I was a part of a program that trained first-generation college students and students from minority backgrounds to pursue a Ph.D. And so one of the aspects of that training was to do research, like basically produce a mini thesis. And I was a sociology minor and an economics major, and I kind of leaned more toward my sociology classes because it helped me answer some of the questions about the challenges that I saw growing up in Lamar County, Alabama. I saw the effects of NAFTA on the job market there. And so sociology was talking more about poverty and inequality and stratification. And it just like this light bulb went off. It's like, oh, wow, this is what I experienced. This is what I saw among my family and my friends' parents growing up. And when I was researching programs, I was leaning toward sociology PhD programs because of that line of inquiry and the answers that were being answered, or the questions that were being answered in those classrooms. And so I remember reading about a particular program that had a specialty in demography. And I didn't know what demography was, but just the description kind of piqued my interest. And I told one of my mentors about it, and he said, well, if you want to study demography, you need to go to Penn State. So I applied to Penn State, and they're one of the few programs in the country that offer a PhD in demography. And so it just kind of happened by accident in some ways, but shaped by my upbringing and having like this quest to deeply understand like the economic conditions of where I grew up.
That is so cool how your experience growing up sort of shaped you and led you to this path, despite being a Nittany Lion. Who knew?
I mean, roll tide for life, but you know, I appreciate Penn State more that now that I'm not there. I didn't have the it was a little bit too cold for me being an Alabama girl, but I appreciate it in the back end.
I totally get that. Well, so in your own words, tell us a little bit about this problem, workforce problem, and how what's happening here in Alabama compares to what you're seeing happen across the country.
You know, if one word were to describe the problem, I would just say complex. And so I guess we would take some time to try to disentangle the complexity of the issue. Alabama is unique because we have an aging population. Now, that alone doesn't make us unique, but some of the challenges that comes along with workforce recruitment and retention, we are experiencing that at a different level because our population is older than our southern peers and compared to the national average. And so if Alabama is able to address this issue, we could set the template for solving this issue across the country because we're just experiencing it first, or one of the first, or to this level of severity per se. With that being said, the aging population is definitely a problem. Spatial mismatch is also an issue. If you think about the distribution of Alabama's population as well as our jobs, I would say they run along I-65 and I-20, right? And so what does that do to parts of our state that doesn't have the transportation access, or there's more opportunity cost to access those jobs? People are more likely to opt out of the labor market because of the cost associated with accessing jobs. So transportation, spatial mismatch, aging population, as well as the wages that are offered for those jobs, because if the opportunity cost or the transaction cost of accessing jobs is higher, then the wages have to incentivize people to enter that field as well, or enter the market.
I think when we look at workforce participation numbers, for example, in Alabama, we tend to be on the wrong side of a lot of statistics, and this is one of them. I mean, nationally, workforce participation's hovering right around 61%. Here in Alabama, we're below 57.5% today. So if we have small and aging population and only a little better than 1 in 2 is participating, it's no wonder we're feeling this problem in a real kind of way.
Well, I do want to say that, so we have to look at what is the benchmark. So you can benchmark against other populations, including the national average, or you can benchmark across time, right? So Alabama's labor force participation rate peaked at about 1997. So the late 90s, early 2000s is when we saw that peak in the population. That is also when the largest, or a very, large demographic group, more notably the baby boomers, were peak working age, right? So that is important because we have to understand how labor force participation is even calculated, right? That the numerator, of course, is the number of employed plus the number of people unemployed over the working age population, right? And so if your working age population is declining or increasing, that the denominator is going to shift, accordingly. So because we have demographic shifts in which we have an aging population, we have a declining population that is on the horizon, your labor force participation rates are going to also shift. And so sometimes I think that people put too much emphasis on that rate without really understanding the dynamics behind what goes into the formula, right? For those to be considered unemployed, you have to be actively looking for work and not, and not attached to a job, but actively looking for work. And so one of the things Alabama likes to boast is our low unemployment rate. Well, a part of that is because people have stopped looking for work, right? And so we're in the state, we're complaining about low labor force participation, and a low unemployment rate. We boast that, which we're among, we we rank better on that metric, but they're tied together. So a part of, I think, our challenge is understanding why people have opted out of the labor market. It's going to be very difficult for us to address some of those other issues around births and deaths. And that doesn't mean we shouldn't, but understanding what is your demographic landscape as it is, and how can we create solutions around what it is right now instead of creating these new, trying to fabricate realities.
Yep.
So.
No, it's you're starting to unpack some of the complexities of this problem, and it gets deep really, really quickly.
Very quickly.
We've heard a lot about the sort of population replacement rate and how that number needs to be for a population at or above 2.1 children per woman. Mm-hmm. And today in the United States, we're about 1.67. Mm-hmm. We're also hearing statistics, and you may correct me if I have any, but we're hearing a lot of statistics about by 2033, 2034, in the absence of immigration, our national population actually starts to contract. Is that kind of consistent with what you have seen and learned?
I think it'd be a little bit later than that. From what I've seen, it would be about 2050 for the national average to see this contraction. I have to go back and review that because you can get different numbers based off of projections, right? People love to ask demographers or economists or whomever, what will the population be like at X year? My first answer to I don't know. But based off of historical trends, based off of also contemporary trends relating to vital statistics, here's our best answer for that. So and there's a lot of assumptions that are made, and so let's just say a range, right? What we are projecting is that there will eventually be a decline in the population, and within averages, it masks heterogeneity, right? So there will be states that experience that sooner than others. Alabama may experience it sooner because of the effect of COVID on our death rates. It was unprecedented. The fact we were trending toward a decline in natural increase, meaning there were more births than deaths before the pandemic. But the pandemic was that demographic tipping point, and now in the first 3 years of 2020, I haven't looked at the 2024 numbers yet because Alabama Department of Public Health, I don't believe, has released them. We now have more deaths than births.
It's really pretty frightening. And to your point, COVID kind of took a problem that was already starting to happen and just accelerated it.
Absolutely. That's what we saw here.
It's really scary. So would you say, in our work, pre-pandemic in Alabama, we saw 3.5% unemployment, but about 26% underemployment. And so a lot of our workforce campaigns were targeting people who we sort of deemed potential career changers. So we could target those people and say, hey, there might be a better job or career path for you that you might want to consider. In a post-pandemic environment, we're starting to target people who are not in the workforce that you were speaking to earlier, because that number has really ballooned. What was the role of COVID, and understanding it was an accelerant, but on the workforce participation side, the number of people opting out of work, How do you think COVID affected that group of people?
Nationally, what we saw was that there were people who left the labor market because it was somewhat more difficult to stay engaged, given some of the inertia of remaining employed. Were we going to be virtual? Were we not? Childcare responsibilities within families, the impact of death can disrupt workforce participation. It's just a lot of uncertainty can contribute to changes in labor market participation, but we're seeing things rebound. Actually, the latest numbers I saw were that Alabama's labor force participation was at 57.7%. And so that, like, those few tenths may sound like not a big deal, but those are tens of thousands of workers. Mm-hmm. And so it is suggesting that people are starting to re-enter the labor market. But whether that's due to demographic shifts or real change, we still need to unpack those numbers.
And I guess the other thing that we need to examine is it enough, right? Mm-hmm. So if we go from 57.4 to 57.7% participation in Alabama, or nationally, if we go from 61% or so to 61.1 or 2%, it could be tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands. Nationally, it could be millions of people. But is it enough to fill the needs of the job market?
I believe that the Alabama Department of Commerce have measured what would be enough. From my own research, if we were at the national average, I think there would be at more than 200,000 more workers in Alabama's labor force than there are now. So, I mean, that's very consequential. So more of the answer is, why aren't we at the national average? And I would like to reframe a few things. Our economy has changed, our demographics have changed, and it makes me ponder, should our metrics change, right? Because labor force participation is measured by people who are 16 plus in the labor market. Is that age appropriate, given cultural and social shifts around college and just entry into the labor market? Maybe we should look at 24 plus. But we do know everyone does not go to college, so we don't want to ignore those who may opt for technical training, be able to go straight from high school to the labor market, or an apprenticeship type training. So I do think we need to include more dynamic and more diverse measures to measure the diversity of our economy and the diversity of human economic behavior. Because I think it's easier for us to use very caustic terms around, dramatic, dangerous, frightening, when we're using old measures to solve new problems or to describe the complex, a more complex labor market.
Yeah. Well, it's funny, the statistics starting with kids who are 16 years old. My oldest is 17, and he works at Smoothie King. And in his second week of work, he came to me and he said, "Dad, now that I'm working, should I just start paying my own way?"
I love that.
And I said, "Well, son, let's just look at your spending habits versus what you're earning at Smoothie King." I said, "It looks like it takes you 3.5 weeks to earn what you spent in 2. So I don't think that's going to work out well for you." So there's a lot of learning. But to your point, I think we need to think differently about how we measure these statistics and what the outputs of those measurements are, so that we can make determinations around educational goals and objectives, industry needs for human capital, and ways in which we can deal with the scarcity of human capital that's causing a lot of people a lot of heartburn right now. So, as you think about the demographic makeup of our workforce nationally, I know you said we're aging here in Alabama. What's the national picture looking like for sort of generationally?
So right now, when I think about those who are 65 plus, I was just looking at this for the state of Alabama recently. Let's just say we're about 14 to 16% of the population. Nationally, by 2050, I think we're supposed to be around 20%, projecting Alabama may be 23%. But that also masks the heterogeneity across the counties. There are some counties that may be approaching 30%, 65 plus. So, but is that a bad thing, right? I mean, when we think about the evolution of societies, people growing older is a marker of a society advancing, right? We have better health, longer life,
A richer
life
society.
expectancy in general has increased when we think about it broadly. Of course, there's been some tick down in life expectancy because of like opioid use and heart disease, all these things. So, but in general, if we think of it over the span of 100 years, right? Is this is a great thing. So I want to be cautious about us talking about an aging population because we all want to age, right?
I'm doing it every day.
Right, exactly. Like, what's the alternative to that? In the same vein, I think about the U.S. and one of the ethos, or ideally is an ethos of being an American, is like we have freedom, right? So if I want children, I can have them. If I don't want children, I don't have to have them, right? And so I do think there are people who want them or would be more likely to have them if it were not as costly. So and why I mention that is that this is a conversation about policy and solutions around that, and also human behavior and how people interact with society and policies and the realities of the economic context to make fertility decisions and that impact their mortality and morbidity. And so we do see, like, I'm thinking of Utah, for example. Their fertility rates are above the national average. They are getting that 2.1 and above, children per childbearing age woman. And so I do think there is something to be said about a dynamic in which there's more economic stability and, a family structure and, that in cultures that kind of support family formation and childbearing. So we can't ignore that. That is something going on there. And so that's where we're also going to see a lot of population growth across the country. When I look at the demographic centers there and some of the projections they put out, is one of the fastest growing states, if not the fastest growing state in the country. And they're still economically very, well off. So I think there's a unique case study there that can be explored. But there are also other states that are economically well off where you see there's a decline in childbearing. And I do think that it is a reality when I think about anecdotally with my friends. Like when childcare costs $2,500 per child, you're going to think about it, I also think in the United States, we are incentivized, capital moves, and we are incentivized to maximize our income in a capitalist system. And therefore, some of us have to move toward where we can maximize our income. And oftentimes that means we're moving away from our family or our support systems that can help us raise our children. It is like there's in-kind transfers that happen with, you know, that are very expensive to get in the economic market versus if we get it from our family. And so that may change your family formation patterns. Maybe I'm only have one child instead of three. So all of that interacting together makes a difference. And so you may think I'm talking too much about fertility, given your question was about aging, but if you have fewer children being born, then your population that's still in the base or the denominator are going to be older. So all of this is kind of a symbiotic dance, right? Because of course, if you have more children in the population who are younger, that's going to decrease your median age as one of the metrics we look at. So you can't talk about one without the other.
As you said at the outset of this conversation, it is a very complicated problem. And, you know, thinking about some of the policy references that you made, I'm no policy expert, but I suspect policy decisions that we make today, based on what's happening or has happened to this point, we may not feel the ramifications of those decisions for years.
That's true. And the operative word there is may. Because culturally, once it has been set in place that around the number of children that families have, it's hard to rebound that. Because we've seen that internationally in places like Japan and China. And China is kind of like the textbook example of this with their one-child policy. It had been the case for so long when they tried to relax the policy or actually just say, okay, have more children where they tested it. It was difficult for people to change their fertility behaviors because it had already became ingrained culturally.
They learned that behavior.
Yes, it's learned. And so saying, okay, never mind, or a generation or so later, it doesn't always work. And so, but I don't think that's an excuse not to try, but we have to be patient, I think is the point there. But I also think that the way our political system is set up, policy is typically within the confines of an administration, which is termed, right? Like if you have your governorships or whatever, local, state, federal policy is within the terms of whatever administration is present. And they want to see something right now or within their, administrative term. And so humans just don't operate within those contours.
It's hard to talk about things that are so abstract. I mean, the workforce problems we're talking about, it's not like a politician can go have a pretty photo in front of a workforce problem or in front of a workforce solution unless it's a training center. It's not a very sexy problem to try to solve. And perhaps that's why we're trying to solve it so late in the game, given that we've known this was coming for many, many years. If you were advising policymakers nationally, or if you were a policymaker nationally, do you have any thoughts on what decisions you might make today, given that you probably have a better understanding than most policymakers about demographic makeup of the country, how that varies state to state or region to region? Do you have any advice for those guys? Or if you were in charge, what policy decisions might you consider making?
That is an amazing question. When it comes to family formation and having children, I would say childcare is huge. I think that can be solved on two fronts. One, I think like your most fundamental economic institution is your family. Like that's just the foundation. That's a system, and that's where you have like more proximity to make individual choices. So I do think we need to encourage more multi-generational family structures. and maybe there should be tax credits or incentives for that. I say that because one of my friends just recently told me that, and maybe it was a friend of a friend, had a damage to their home and they had to move out, and the insurance company gave them some money for to move to a different home while there were renovations being done. And so the couple and the children moved in with the grandparents, and the grandparents were just overjoyed that they could spend time with their grandkids. And I think they were getting $1,800 a month for their insurance company, and they were just giving it to the parents as rent for living there. And I use that anecdote to say, maybe some of like the tax incentives can be toward, okay, mom, whom I trust, grandmom, whom I trust, here's some extra money to help me take care of my children, or I know that there have been institutions or nonprofits in Alabama that have definitely championed for child tax credits. I think that it'll be interesting to see the implications of that. I believe the Women's Foundation has been very instrumental in that work. I would start there, and maybe that's just that's just a little bit of bias because that's where I am in my life. That's what I hear my friends speaking of as they're thinking about having children. It's like, okay, this is very costly, especially compared to how much they bring in income, right? Because if you're paying $2,000 a month for one child to be in childcare, compared to the median income that people make in this state, even if you make twice, 3 times the median, that's a huge chunk of your salary.
There's just not a lot of margin there, not a lot of room to operate.
Right. So that would be one policy. I also think we need to think differently about who's in the labor market. People's lives are complex and they're not linear, and people may opt in and out of the labor market at different times of their lives, and that should be okay. I think that we can promote better public health so that we can prevent some of the morbidity and early deaths. We do have higher death rates in this state compared to others. We do have higher morbidity rates that lend to poor health that can also impact people's participation in the labor market. Again, that seems very abstract, but cumulatively, those events add up. And so I do think promoting a healthier society is important. Also, people may not always live where they work, or maybe they should be able to go back and forth, because I do think that people who remain in Alabama, they have a stronger attachment to place. That tends to be the case here. I don't know of any studies that say that, but just sociological observations. I would suspect that to be true. And so if you have someone who is in rural Alabama, who may be there because of family reasons, maybe they're looking after their parents or something like that, maybe they should have more flexibility and maybe going to work in Tuscaloosa or at somewhere where there's an automobile manufacturing plant, but they can then also go home. So maybe this back and forth, I think there needs to be more flexibility in work across the board. Like this traditional 36, 40-hour week, however many weeks out of the year, may not work for everybody. And so if there's more, but they may be willing to do something like 3 weeks out of the month with some housing located near a facility. Maybe we need to think differently about, the complexity of people's lives and allow for flexibility accordingly.
Yeah, I think this is another area where COVID sort of accelerated some of these trends.
Yes, and I'm just thinking out loud, but there are it's easier for people who provide a service to work remotely or to have flexibility. I don't think we've been as innovative in thinking about people who are tied to like manufacturing and also having flexibility in their work arrangements. So maybe that's easier said than done. People's, attitudes kind of shift slower than the realities of economic and social, issues.
We got to be more creative.
Yes, for sure.
Well, I've asked you a lot of questions today. Maybe there's a question that I haven't asked you that you'd like to address. So if that is the case, what would be your answer to the question I didn't ask?
One of the things that I think is overlooked in Alabama is, as far as human capital, is one of our largest exports is probably college-age students. We are graduating people across the state. Alabama, the University of Alabama is at 40,000 students now as of this year. I suspect Auburn's not that far behind. Several of our higher ed institutions are growing their student body. I think University of North Alabama is an example of that. But compared to other states, our retention of our college graduate is lower than the national average. I do think there's some cachet around moving to a big city and starting work in a larger city. Like it's kind of like it's a status symbol. It's like, you get your Mercedes or your Lexus, right? To be able to say you work in a city like Nashville or Houston, it's sexy to say that. It feels good, right? But there's also some, people are being pragmatic because I do think there are more horizontal and vertical work opportunities in those areas because they have a more diverse labor market. And so that's very real. But I do think there needs to be more efforts on retaining our college graduates by getting them connected to growing industries, particularly in advanced manufacturing, aerospace, or wherever Alabama's want to place their economic incentives while they're still in college, because they may be more likely to stay afterwards. But even if they decide to leave, we should incentivize people who are making sound economic decisions in the labor market. It should make us want to up our game and make Alabama more, a better opportunity for these graduates and to compete. We should encourage them to come back later. So I think it would be really cool if we kept a database. Maybe we don't need to reinvent the wheel. Maybe something like LinkedIn is enough, where there are employers who are having a hard time finding qualified workers. We can go back and it's like, well, we spent taxpayer money on educating this person. Even if they paid tuition, like there's other services, like public safety, roads, whatever, public infrastructure that they benefited from by being here at some point. Maybe if you have spent some time here, you're more likely to come back versus someone who has no exposure to the state. And given that we are recruiting more students from out of state, at our public institutions, that's an opportunity for us to, recruit them later down their career pipeline to come back and work for some of our companies in the state.
Well, I think if I had any say, I'd say Nyesha for president, or at least Nyesha for policymaker. So Nyesha, thank you so much for joining us today. I've learned a lot, and I'm sure our listeners have too. We would love to have you back to unpack some of these challenges. I think you've indicated a few areas where we're going to be looking for folks to address on future episodes. So I hope everyone listening at home will tune in next time. We're going to hear from Jeff Leonard. He is the Vice President of Media and Strategic Communications for the National Association of Convenience Stores, or NACS. We'll discuss ways he is leading his industry's efforts to attract and retain a workforce. If we're lucky, we'll hear about his love and appreciation for The Simpsons. Hope you'll join us.